Hey guys, welcome back. So today on this video, we're talking about police in Canada and police in the United States. I have a friend that is a police officer in the United States, and he's always ragging on his job, but he's also ragging on police officers from other countries. So I thought it was interesting to figure out who makes more money and who has a better job. So let's go ahead and look into it. So first thing I want to let you know is police officers get paid varying amounts of money depending on which city they work in. So a lot of this is going to be generalized based off of public information I was able to pull up. So first off, how much do police officers make in each country, Canada and the United States? So as of May 2026, it looks like the average salary for a police officer in the United States is about $64,000 per year. But that number varies widely depending on where you're working. If you're working in a major metropolitan area like New York or Los Angeles, it's going to be a lot more. But if you're working in a rural department in a small town, it might be $35,000 per year. Now in Canada, it looks like it's managed by the RCMP. They're the ones who set the wages for the police officers in Canada. So those officers start at $71,000 per year, and they can actually reach up to $115,000 within 3 years. Now, of course, if you're working in a police department like Toronto or Vancouver, those departments actually pay a lot more. So if we're comparing the two just on the base salary, Canada wins. And it's not really close considering how fast the income increases as a Canadian police officer. $115,000 within 3 years is not that bad. In fact, there's a lot of police departments in the US where the police officer is going to have to work a decade to reach that level of pay. So we all know that the base salary is just the beginning. What about the pay and compensation behind the yearly salary? So this is where the comparison gets really interesting. So in the US, most municipal police departments allow the police officer to retire in 20 or 25 years, and that's going to pay anywhere between 50 and 75% of their final salary. And a lot of times that's not really dependent on their age. It's only on their service time. So if somebody enters the force at, let's say, 22 years old and they serve for 25 years, at the age of 47, which is not really that old, they could potentially have a pension for the rest of their life. And with a pension like that, that's definitely one of the most valuable financial assets for any American worker. Now, if we look at Canada, the CMP pension is similarly structured. However, the RCMP also covers room and board, uniform, training, insurance, travel to and from training at no additional cost to the recruit. However, police officers in the US often can bill overtime, which can increase their annual salary $20,000 up to $50,000 extra per year on top of their regular annual pay. So that could put their total compensation to $130,000, $150,000 depending on the precinct. So as you can see, both countries offer strong financial pay. However, Canada, with their base salary, it ramps up much quicker within 3 years. So what about the training? Who pays for the training? The department or the recruit? So this is a pretty important financial difference between the two police officers. So for example, in the US, training models are going to vary depending on the department. However, most departments require the recruit to attend what's called police academy. Usually police academy is going to be run by the local community college. And at that community college, usually the recruit is going to pay for that training. So that tuition could be anywhere between $5,000 to $15,000 before that recruit's even hired. So you might think about that's kind of strange. You're basically paying to get the job. And a lot of police officers in the US start their career in debt for that police training. Now, if we look at Canada, they run it completely different. The RCMP covers your uniform, your room and board for training, training courses, insurance, and even travel to and from your training entirely. And as of April 2026, the cadet recruitment allowance is $1,000 per week during that 26-week training period. So that basically means the recruits are paid $26,000 to train to become a police officer in Canada. So that's a pretty stark difference. Canada pays you to become a police officer. In the US, you're going to pay for the schooling to become a police officer. So with this paid training, how does it compare between the two different countries, being a police officer in Canada and the US? This is actually shocking when I looked this up because the difference in the training is extraordinarily different between the US and Canada. So we'll look at Canada. The RCMP training runs for 26 weeks and it's run in Regina, Saskatchewan. They're going to cover things like laws, firearms, de-escalation, community policing, and field training. As you can see, it's a comprehensive program, and even most Canadian municipal agencies require similar or even longer training for their police officers. Now, if we look at the US, the average police academy is going to last for about 21 weeks, so a little bit shorter than the RCMP in Canada. And one of the biggest differences, US police officers have much more training on firearms than on de-escalation in provocative situations. And there are some states in the US that only require 8 to 10 weeks for their police officers before they can go into the field. So on a national level, there's not really a standard. Each state's going to set their own minimum requirements, and some states set it very, very low. So that's a big difference. Canada has their standards set at the national level. And then when you look at the US, they have about 18,000 police agencies, and each one of them is going to set their own training requirements. So the fragmentation is large. large. But what about how dangerous this job is? What's the difference on the job risk in Canada and the US? So this is where the numbers really become strikingly different. Both police officers in Canada and the US run a real risk, but the level of danger between the two countries is really staggering. If we look at the homicide rate in the US, it's about 5.7 homicides per 100,000 inhabitants. Now, if we compare that with Canada, they are at about 1.9 homicides per 100,000 in the population. So as you can see, the US is almost triple. And by default, the US police officers are policing a much more violent environment than Canada. And part of the reason for that is the gun ownership factor. It's well known that the US has the highest rate of gun ownership in the entire world. So when an American police officer responds to a call, there's a realistic possibility that that person that they're going to meet is going to be armed with a weapon. Of course, that does happen in Canada, but the chances are much lower. And the reason for that is Canada has much stricter gun laws and much lower gun ownership rates than the US. So that means that the police officer in Canada statistically is going to be working in a safer environment in Canada than the police officer in the United States. That's not an opinion. That's all based off of crime data. So what about use of force? This is a pretty hot topic, especially with the public shootings between police officers and civilians. So the statistics show that there's actually 33 fatal police shootings per 10 million inhabitants in the US. And supposedly that's the highest rate for high income countries. Now, if we compare that with Canada, they have about 10 deaths per 10 million inhabitants that are police related. So the US has 3 times the amount of fatal police shootings than their Canadian counterpart. So you might ask yourself, what's the reason for that? There's not really one particular reason. It's a multitude of reasons that combine to create an environment of more chances of police killings. One of those is a higher rate of gun ownership in the US. So police officers in the US face armed suspects more often than their counterparts in Canada. Also, training differences probably play a role into that. Canada has mandatory de-escalation policies at the national level, and that training is applied much more consistently since it is the norm at the national level, as opposed to the US. Each department's going to run its own training how they see fit. So what about public trust between the two countries? This is important because it affects the way that the community interacts with the police officer anytime there is an investigation. It also indicates how police officers are treated when they're encountered on the street. So ultimately, how safe and rewarding being a police officer is. So if we look at Canada, for an example, first, citizens express about 73% approval rating for their police officers. Now, if we look at the US, supposedly it's about 51% that the population has, and it has been declining year by year according to Gallup. So is there anything that the US does better for their police officers than Canada? Yes, absolutely. There are true advantages to being a police officer in the US over Canada. One of those benefits is overtime. Many officers in large markets like LA, New York, Chicago often add $20,000, $30,000, up to $50,000 to their annual salary just by signing up for additional overtime. That means a motivated officer in the US can easily out-earn top paid officers in Canada. Also, police officers in the US have much more career diversity available to them. There's over 18,000 precincts to choose from, and that's on the federal level, state level, municipal, transit, universities. And inside each of those, there's a lot of different career paths to choose from. In addition, police officers in the US can take on specialized roles with the FBI, DEA, and even the Secret Service. So those options just simply don't exist in Canada. So where is it better to be a police officer, in the US or Canada? Well, based off of everything that I've been able to find, I would say that Canada probably wins in this comparison for a number of different reasons. First off, Canada pays you to train to become a police officer, as opposed to the US, you need to pay for your police academy. Also in Canada, they're going to reach their base salary much quicker than in the US without having to do overtime. The working environment in Canada is statistically safer than in the US. Also in Canada, public trust is a lot higher. So that means each interaction that you have with the public is going to be much more enjoyable. Now, if we look at the US, they definitely win if you're looking at the total annual pay, if you're willing to do overtime. Also in the US, the amount of career paths and training that's available is unmatched, especially since there's 18,000 different precincts to choose from. And in each of those precincts, you're going to have different job roles and opportunities. Also, another thing to consider is if you're going to be a police officer in, let's say, Los Angeles or New York, your total earnings potential is going to be much higher. But for the average person walking into a department without any kind of specific department in mind, the data points towards Canada as the more financially rewarding, consistently trained, and statistically safer place to work. So there you have it. Are you a police officer in the US and you think it's better than being a police officer in Canada? Leave a comment below and let the rest of us know, and I'll see you on the next video.